Hello, and welcome to this Department of Local Government and Communities webinar looking at the disclosure of financial interests in returns. My name is Alex McColgan. I am a Project Officer in the Local Government Regulation and Support Branch, and I'll be taking you through the presentation today. This session will cover the disclosure of financial interests by Council members in returns. We're going to be looking specifically at the types of financial interest required to be disclosed by the Local Government Act 1995 and its regulations in both primary returns and annual returns. You can find more information on all of these interests in the Department's operational guidelines, specifically Guideline number 21, which deals with disclosures in primary and annual returns. When you're elected to Council, one of the first requirements under the Local Government Act is that you make a declaration of office. That declaration is basically an undertaking to faithfully and honestly fulfil the duties of your office for the people in your district. In other words, while you're always going to have private interests, when you're acting in your office, the community must always come first. Council members are subject to a range of legislation that governs their ethical and legal actions, whether it be the financial interest provisions of the Local Government Act or the conduct provisions of the Corruption and Crime Commission Act. But the basic principle of all of these provisions is that the public interest must always take precedence over the private interests of elected members. Under the Act, for instance, elected members have a responsibility to take particular action where questions of financial interest or conflicts of interest regarding impartiality arise in council deliberations or decisions. It's all about being accountable and transparent in decision-making. For a council member, declaring conflicts of interest at meetings is one part of this process. But another part of that process is to make information about certain interests available for ongoing public inspection by disclosing those interests in public documents called financial interest returns. Financial interest returns contain information about your private interests that you must disclose as an elected member. The returns are included on a register for public inspection and remain there for as long as you're in your office. So in other words, as long as you're a council member, that information remains public. The Local Government Act requires that any relevant person complete a primary return within 3 months of his or her start day. Subsequent to that, an annual return must be completed by 31st of August in each following year, for as long as you hold the office that makes you a relevant person. So, what makes you a relevant person, and when does this whole process start? Under Section 5.74 of the Local Government Act, a relevant person includes any council member of a local government, the CEO of the local government, any employee with council delegated powers, any employee on a committee with council members, and any employee nominated by council as a designated employee for the purpose of completing returns. The relevant person's start day is when a council member makes his or her declaration of office, or when an employee commences one of the above roles. Your primary return is the initial snapshot of your financial interests at the time you commence your role. In other words, it represents all your relevant interests at a particular point in time. Annual returns are then required only to track any changes in those interests. As part of this process, they also carry an additional requirement for you to disclose certain gifts or contributions to travel that have been given to you in your capacity as a council member during the preceding financial year. The period covered by each annual return is called the return period, and we'll look at how the Act defines that period now. Basically, where the last return lodged by a relevant person was a primary return, the return period for the following annual return starts from the day following the person's start day to the 30th of June ending that financial year. In other words, for a council member, from the day following your declaration of office to the next 30th of June. Where the last return lodged by the relevant person was an annual return, the return period for the next annual return covers the 12 months ending on 30th of June of the current year. Let's look first at what needs to be disclosed in primary returns. These requirements are set out in sections 5.78 to 5.85 of the Local Government Act and are basically as follows. Real property in the district and adjoining districts. Sources of income above $500. Beneficial interests in trusts. Interests and positions in corporations, including shareholdings. And debts exceeding $500, except for debts to a relative or an authorised money lending institution. It should be noted that the interests to be disclosed in financial interest returns relate only to the relevant person, not to partners, spouses or other relatives. However, it's important to note that if you become a member of a regional council, you need to lodge returns for that regional council as well, and the real property you disclose in that return will have to be any property within the regional council's district and any local governments adjoining it. And a disclosure need only describe the nature of the interest, not its value or extent. The exception to this arises in annual returns, which we cover next. The disclosures required in annual returns are any additions or changes to previous primary or annual returns, including dispositions of property, any gifts exceeding a value of $200 given during the return period by the same donor, unless they are an exempt donor, and any travel contributions exceeding a value of $200 provided during the return period by the same contributor, unless they are an exempt contributor. Just a quick note on these exemptions. In the case of gifts, the exemption is for gifts from relatives, so all those Christmas presents from your family don't need to be disclosed in your annual return. In the case of travel contributions, again, contributions from relatives are exempt from being disclosed, but so are travel contributions from government agencies or from employers who are paying you to travel for work-related purposes. There's also an exemption for travel contributions made by a political party where your travel relates to activities on behalf of that party. Remember that each return is like a page in a book. Where there hasn't been any changes to one of your interests, make a note that there's been no change and refer to the return where you first declared that interest. If there are sections of the return that just aren't relevant to you, it's a good idea to mark these sections as not applicable. You don't want anyone's overactive imagination trying to fill in the blanks for you. Let's go through the sections in primary and annual returns as they're set out in the Local Government Act. We'll start with a primary return for our relevant person, then look at how any changes might be reflected in a subsequent annual return. As you can see, our council member in this case, a Mr. Relevant Person, had two properties to declare in his primary return, a house he owns at 10 Fictional Street in Factville, and a property he leases not too far away at 7 Imaginary Place in Real Estates, that exciting new residential subdivision that everyone's talking about. No need to disclose property values, of course, but what does need to be disclosed is that an interest in these properties exists. Now, Councillor Person's day job is in mining administration at Rio Grande. No need to disclose how much he earns, but his employer needs to be identified as it could have implications for matters that come before council in the future. Again, no need to provide the amount of income he's receiving from that trust, but the details of the trust itself do need to be disclosed. And it's the same with any other sources of income. He needs to disclose the source itself, but not the amount of the income he receives. As you can see, Councillor Person also has interests in a couple of other trusts, and in each case it's the details of the trusts themselves that need to be disclosed rather than the extent of our councillor's interest in them. It's the same with his shareholdings. There's no requirement for Councillor Person to divulge the value of his shares, but the extent of that value may have implications if he needs to consider if yet more mining ends up having a matter before council. And while his debt to Ebenezer Estate is obviously more than $500, otherwise he wouldn't have had to disclose it, it's not necessary to declare the exact amount of the debt. You can see here that Councillor Person has also made a discretionary disclosure about having borrowed money from Mr. Lott. The debt must be less than the $500 which requires disclosure, but our councillor has decided to disclose it anyway. Section 5.87 of the Act allows council members the discretion to disclose certain interests even when they don't have to, simply because they might consider it appropriate to do so. Now, let's see if anything's changed by the time Councillor Person puts in his following annual return. It looks as though he sold his place on Fictional Street because his annual return now includes reference to owning a house at 20 Change Street. He still leases that property at 7 Imaginary Place though. No change to his employment or other sources of income. But note, he's still filling in these sections and making reference to the earlier return where he disclosed the relevant information. His other trusts are unchanged, except of course that he's changed his own address to reflect that move to Change Street he made in the last few months. Now, here's a couple of those instances where he has needed to disclose amounts. A gift he received from a local investment firm, and that contribution he received from the privately funded Good Government Foundation when they asked him to attend a local government conference in Canberra. These are the cases where disclosure of amounts is required. Now keep in mind that he was able to accept that travel as a contribution from a non-profit organisation, which will likely develop him in his role as a councillor. But it must still go in the annual return and will have implications if the foundation has matters before council in future. Because now that its contribution is disclosed in the return, the foundation will be considered a closely associated person to the council member. No changes to his shares or debts in the period covered by the return. But here's the reference to that house sale that resulted in his move to Change Street. As you can see, like all sources of income except for gifts, he's disclosed the source but not the monetary value. And finally, no changes to his discretionary disclosures, but he's included reference to the disclosure he made in his previous return. Keep in mind that all returns must be signed and dated, and the CEO needs to acknowledge receipt of your return with written confirmation. This is because there are serious penalties under the Act for failing to lodge a return. Now keep in mind that continuing advice and support from the Department, includes advice and assistance for elected members, publications for elected members, including the Operational Guideline number 21 that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and other support like these information webinars. And remember that you can always contact us directly on the Local Government Advisory Hotline. The email address you see here for the hotline, like the phone number, will make sure that you get straight through to us in the Advice and Support branch. And with that, it only remains to thank you for your participation and enjoy the webinar.